I'm now going to ask Michelle Butler from the Department of Sustainability and Environment in Victoria to come and talk. So Michelle works in the Eco Markets implementation as a coordinator and is responsible for the EcoTender trials that Victoria has been running, emerging over the last dozen years or so. And so there's quite a lot of learning in those, in some of the state agencies and some of the experience of bringing some of these programs to reality. So, Michelle, please.
I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of our EcoTender program, a very short overview of that, but a little bit more detail about the metrics that sit behind our program, some of the challenges that we've been trying to work through, and some of the work that we're doing with our partners. We work with quite a few CMAs across Victoria. At least 6 of them are implementing tenders, and we're quite involved in supporting those programs. As well as looking at some of the reporting outcomes that we've got coming out of our processes and some of the future direction that we're doing. So that's just that. So EcoTender is about multiple outcomes. It's a market-based instrument where landowners tender to implement actions on their properties that result in environmental improvements. And we're very interested in the public benefit aspect of that. We're interested in purchasing environmental services to meet a number of department priorities, such as native vegetation gain, improved water quality and catchment health. We also recognise that environmental services can be produced together, so this is why we have a focus on multiple outcomes. So our program is specifically targeted at multiple environmental outcomes, which differs from most conservation tenders which are running across Victoria. Most of them are focused on a single outcome, such as wetland improvement, bush tender or river tender. But what it means is that we can consider the benefits and the trade-offs to a catchment of any paddock scale action that actually happens on a site that affects those decisions. And we're very aware of the fact that we've got public funds, so we want to procure value for money products. So what we've been doing over the last couple of years is we've had 3 eco-tenders. The first one was started in 2008 in the Corangamite region. The Catchment Management Authority actually coordinated that project for us, and I was one of the field staff for that project for the Department of Primary Industries. So we had both DSE and primary industry staff being the field staff for that program. The second tender was run in Port Phillip, which is just on the outskirts of Melbourne. So both of these tenders were fairly small in that they were sort of a sub-catchment of much larger area, and we had about $1 million to spend on the ground for those projects. For that project, we actually had a mix of field staff from Landcare, Greening Australia, DSE, and we had Melbourne Water and the Port Phillip Catchment Management Authority sitting on our board for that project. So it was very much a partnership project. And then our final one we've just run last year, and we're just starting to finalise all of the contracts for those now with landowners, was run in West Gippsland catchment, which is the east part of Victoria, but the West Gippsland area, and it covered the whole of the catchment. So we had another variation on the way that we implemented that project. This time I was the implementation officer, but we had a regional implementation person sitting in the CMA so that we were able to improve their capacity to run tenders. And then we had a mix again of staff from Landcare, CMA, DSE and local consultants. So all up of the 3 tenders that we've been running, we've spent about $4 million on the ground. We're funding management works for 1,650 hectares of remnant vegetation and re-veg works, which is about 140 landowners and about 330 sites. We're also protecting about 240 hectares on title. So the things that we've been focusing on in EcoTender are catchment health, so the changes in the catchment, biodiversity values, wetland and river health, and carbon as an additional component. And the thing that we're really most interested in is how do we know we're getting the outcomes we invest in, and are we getting the best value for money? When you're looking at a whole range of different sites, from revegetation to wetlands to rivers, how do we know which one's actually giving us the outcomes that we want? So So we also want to know whether we're actually purchasing multiple outcomes cost effectively, but we are able to compare the different types of the sites, and through our process we're actually able to identify the lowest cost suppliers of that work. And the economists who I work with, because I'm not an economist, but the economists I work with have done some assessment of those processes and have decided that it is actually more cost effective to procure multiple outcomes than it is individual outcomes. And there are also some efficiency gains from running a project, certainly on a catchment scale, targeting a number of different sites. You get a reduction in administration and in implementation costs. So how do we do this? We have a program called ENSIM, which is an environmental systems modelling platform. So it's basically a computer software program, which is a platform for incorporating models and mathematical computations. It allows us to estimate the impacts of the actions on the landscape, so the land management actions that a farmer might undertake, and quantify that change and the environmental benefits of those on-ground works. It allows for the jointly produced environmental outcomes and some of those trade-offs. So, for example, if you have a re-veg project that is improving biodiversity, you want to make sure that it's also not having a negative impact on runoff, or if it is, that you're actually taking that into consideration when you're actually choosing to fund that site over another site. So we want to reduce the possibility of perverse outcomes. So EcoTender runs very much like most other tenders in that a landowner might put in an expression of interest. We have field staff who go out and do a site tour, have a discussion with the landowner about what they want to do. They complete a site assessment, which includes some data collection on the current condition of the site. We use technology which allows us to upload that information directly into our ENSIM modelling program. The landowner chooses their management actions, and the field officer will actually draw up a management plan, an aerial photograph and a species list if they're doing some re-veg or supplementary planting. And then the landowner basically uses that information to help them price their bid and get involved in the tender process. But I suppose the major difference again is that we're targeting multiple outcomes. And the biggest issue there is being able to link the actions on the ground with the outcomes. And of course there's a whole range of issues in between in terms of missing or gaps in scientific information, having best guesses, some actions having multiple impact on different outcomes. So I'll just give you an example here. We might decide to build a fence and plant some trees to exclude stock and revegetate a site. We're always going to have some surrogate measures for those kind of things to actually be able to say that we're improving the habitat, we're reducing the erosion or improving the water quality. In our ENSIM program, we take some of those indicators right at the early stage, and so before you actually go out and build the fence, our modelling program actually tells us that we're doing this action and we expect this change. So you're using indicators such as current condition to try and help you assess that you're actually getting that outcome. So we have a number of metrics that we use. They're all modules, so we can actually work on one metric and look at the detail of that and modify it and improve it as we go if we find that it's being skewed in a certain direction. The catchment health, river health, terrestrial vegetation, wetland health and carbon are the metrics that sit behind our work. And these vary. A couple of them, such as catchment health and carbon, are computational sort of theoretical models. The others are based on data collection programs that we actually have in the department. And some of you would have heard of the index of stream condition or the gain calculator habitat hectares work that our biodiversity unit uses. And I'll just grab one example just to give you a little bit more detail. Within those metrics is a whole heap of preferences and attributes that are favoured by the department in terms of their priorities. And we use a combination of field data collection and modelled and mapped information to inform our decision making. So current condition, which looks at the value of the large trees, the weeds, the understory, those kind of things, is collected out in the field, as well as the site is mapped. Other things such as spatial preference, where the site is in the catchment? Is it close to rivers? Is it connected to remnant vegetation? Those kind of things are layers in our modelling program, as well as the conservation status, rare and threatened species, and the site's current potential as habitat. Some of those things can actually be tweaked up and down, so they can be weighted in terms of priorities. And I guess particularly the rare and threatened species stuff gets weighted, with different partners who want to use these kind of things, probably more than any of the other stuff. So it's already been recognised that, there's a lot of assumptions behind metrics. Sometimes it's the best guess. There is often missing data, but you sort of work with what you've got, and I guess you can just continually improve it. The attributes that we sort of focus on need to be weighted. So again, they're sort of preferenced in terms of the investors. What this does for us is produce these very complex association tables between the actions on the ground and the changes that you expect, but it does allow us to consistently be able to score one site against another site. So this really is just how the score is produced. You can see that there's a range of things that go into it. The site assessment, there's river information, wetland information and vegetation information, depending on the site, that might be collected. The site's mapped. We collect information if we find a new threatened species. We also look at the site's potential habitat, and there's, again, examples of assumptions around those. We have data from the department that looks at if a rare and threatened species is found 5 kilometres around a site, and that site itself that you're looking at is similar habitat and has the right conditions for that species to occur, then we would actually score that site more highly, because we know that that rare species occurs nearby, so it's likely, possible, that it could be habitat. The modelled information, where it is in the landscape, whether it's close to waterways, where it's connected to vegetation, water quality, erosion and runoff, they're all modelled components of our metrics, as well as the landowner actions. Can they maintain the current site quality? Can they improve it? And we also score, in addition, permanent protection, so it gets a much higher score. So all of these things come together in the metrics to produce a score for us to be able to compare the sites. So what it does, the EBI index actually allows us to rank, and the bottom section here is really just the combination of metrics. For us, we value them all, so we actually value them all the same, so they're added together. But the biodiversity and the wetland ones are actually treated differently because just in the way you collect the information. But what it allows us to do is that the landowner really just has to give a price for the work that they want to do over a 5-year period, and that, in combination with the score, allows us to rank the bids and determine which ones are the best value for money. We're really interested in the change in condition, so we really want to know, just because the site's good quality, the thing that we're most interested in is paying for the improvement, as well as, the maintenance of that site so that it's not declining over time. So the zone data that you see there, for every site that is mapped, our NSIM program produces a whole range of data that's based on the change from one land use to another. So if you're going from a grazing site to a re-veg site, it's telling you from that land use to that land use, this is the change in that information. And then a whole site, then we have the combination of those is put together. So we have each of the metrics are indexed and the subscores in those are normalised. So we have mathematicians and economists sitting behind the scene who are actually looking at the distribution of the data in those kind of things to make sure that they're making sense. And then they normalise those so they can actually compare all of those metrics together. So we end up with a score. So that, in combination with the price, is what we can do to rank our bids, what we get to rank our bids. So this is just an example, and that's that curve that Emma was talking about before. We actually have a mathematical algorithm that we also use in our bid panel assessments, which divides the scores between the higher value, lower cost bids and the lower value, high cost bids. And usually what happens is a panel looks at that and they tend to go off with that, tend to choose that cut-off point. So that's identified by a mathematical algorithm, and then usually the discussion is around whether you go above that or you stick to that. Our last West Gippsland project, we actually ran out of funds before we ran out of good projects. But the fact that we have CMA and Landcare involved meant that we could actually follow the projects up that didn't actually get funded. We could actually follow those up with Landcare and CMA, and a lot of those projects were funded through other means as well. So that was a good outcome. 4 minutes, yep. So we work on improving the metrics all the time, and we just continually test and review because we have a huge amount of data sitting behind our projects. And the work that the mathematicians and stuff are doing, they're comparing the expected versus the actual results. We do acknowledge that there are best guesses, but we will try and improve them as we go in terms of what information becomes available. And we also capture some of the lessons that the field staff gives. One of the advantages of having multiple organisations involved in our processes means that we get a lot of feedback that helps them actually, helps us improve those processes for them to use for their work as well. I guess one of the big challenges is trying to balance the priorities of different levels of government and the transaction costs and the complexity. So the more you make a metric complex, the more data that you need to collect. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, as well as multiple investments in one program. One of the land stewardship program that we work with, they have Melbourne Water and Landcare investing in a program, and they basically look at the rank of all the projects and then go decide who will fund what in terms of what meets their needs. It's pretty straightforward. Some of the work that we're doing with the partners at the moment, we're working with Landcare to develop a soil metric, so that's being driven by Landcare. And we're also looking at changing some of the reporting information. So at the moment we can report yearly reductions in recharge and runoff modelled, outcomes from NSIM, and we want to make this information available to our partners as well. So we're working with them. There's a bit of interest. By the end of this year, we're hoping to have a reporting template for them so that they can report on these kind of things for their tenders and grants programs as well. Mark Eigenraam, who I work with, is looking at the national accounting process and making sure that some of the environmental actions can be incorporated into economic accounting. So some of those things I've covered, organisations being able to report on their investment and the contribution of their work. So that's one area that we're working on. New metric designs, looking at web-based processes to reduce transactions in tenders. And I guess there's a lot more opportunity in the co-investment and the carbon market area as well. That's about it.